You know, I wasn't always an indie game and video game channel like I am now. Yeah, there was a time when strategy games, primarily StarCraft, were the focal point of my gaming YouTube channel. That's not to say that I still don't enjoy strategy games, in fact, I goddamn love them. But there was a time where they absolutely dominated my life.
What is going on, YouTube world? This is Mathis445, and I am back with another cast. This will be
No, before that, way before that. Back when PC gaming was just beginning to get its legs, back when Super Metroid was the big game coming out for the SNES, and the SNES and Genesis rivalry was still going quite strong.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
This was a time when PC gaming and console gaming were two totally different beasts. The PC was full of strategy games like Warcraft, Masters of Orion, and Civilization, where the console was dominated by platforming games like Mario, Wario Land, and to an extent Super Metroid. And in 1994, a lot of these titles made their debut. Warcraft, the first one, came out on its small collection of 3.5-inch floppy disks, as did Masters of Orion and the ill-fated Masters of Magic. Warcraft would, of course, spawn its own very successful franchise, including a huge MMO some of you may know, something about being in a world that has war and crafting in it, including its pseudo-spin-off/spiritual successor, StarCraft. But another game came out in 1994, one that mixed elements of the 4X genre, the turn-based combat of something akin to Civilization, and the city-building aspect of something more along the lines of SimCity. It was complex, it was difficult, and it was wholly unique. This game would be known as Xcom Ufo Defense, the love child between Mythos Entertainment and Microprose. Xcom set out to do something very, very different. Something that even years later was never truly reproduced in a successful fashion until Firaxis got their dirty little hands on the franchise. You see, the story for Xcom Ufo Defense was quite simple. Aliens were invading Earth, and the governments around the world were to fund a research organization under the name Extraterrestrial Combat, aka Xcom. You were the commander-in-chief of this project, and it was your duty to set up a base, train soldiers, research technologies, and find new weapons to fend off the alien threat. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, that's really where the simple things ended. As the commander, it was literally your job to manage every single aspect of the XCOM project from here on out. The game would start on a global view screen. Yeah, no, that's literally about right, and a picture of the Earth itself rendered in the game's engine. You would then have to choose where you wanted to put your first XCOM base. Remember, this was a time of very little hand-holding. Where you put your first XCOM base was up to you, and depending on where you put it, would determine your sensor range and where you were able to detect UFOs flying and landing. Of course, the country you put your base on would also be easier to defend as well. And this was important because at the end of each in-game month, all of the nations would evaluate your performance and either raise or lower your funding to the XCOM project, and if they thought you were a lost cause, they would pull their funding altogether. So your first action in the game, just merely deciding where you wanted to build your base, which may have seemed so insignificant, was actually really damn important. So after spending a few hours staring at the global view screen and finally deciding to say, yeah, no, right there, no, you can't change my mind, that's where I'm placing my base, XCOM then took the next big step for you. What was your next step in the XCOM career? Well, this is where you would start seeing the city building aspect of the game. You would get a top-down view of your base and you could build it as you saw fit. Of course, you would start with some basic buildings like your first airship and whatnot and a barracks. Are your soldiers' weapons not even scratching the enemy opponent? Can't get through their armor? Well, you better set aside some funding for new weapons or have your scientists research new alien technologies to maybe pierce their armor. See, distributing your funds in either military, research, or base building was a very important thing as far as XCOM was concerned. You didn't have unlimited funds. And as I said earlier, the nations determined how much money you were going to get depending on how well you were protecting them. Then you had to ask yourself a question. Do you sacrifice Asia to the aliens to buy yourself more time in order to finish the research for your next big super weapon? Or do you send in your army, no matter how hurt or underprepared they are, in order to attempt to keep a key investor in the XCOM project as part of it, by maybe saving them? Decide carefully. It could be your last. The final key aspect of the original XCOM, as far as gameplay was concerned, was perhaps the most important one to the game, and that was the ground combat mode. This is where you spent most of your time playing. It was a turn-based game in the truest sense. On your turn, you would move your troops from the Sky Ranger, the ship you arrived on, into the randomly generated battlefield with one objective: search and destroy. You couldn't see much in front of you. In fact, the entirety of the randomly generated map was covered in a fog of war until you explored it, and aliens always had the upper hand for the beginning half of the game, shooting at you from unseen places and always scampering just out of sight, taking cover behind a wall that you could destroy if you needed to, but you would waste precious action points, you know, the resource that you use to move and command your troops, to do so. Oh, and if your soldiers died in battle, they were dead. No, really, they were dead. Lose them and you lose everything they ever earned in battle. But if they survived, the feeling of accomplishment was immense. They would gain experience, they would be promoted, be able to use new weapons, be less likely to panic under fire or if one of their friends dies right in front of them. And at the end of the game, you would have a solid squad of trained vets ready to give their lives to win this war. It was up to you to make sure they didn't have to. So, in the beginning, if trying to decide where to spend your XCOM funds and worrying about making a bad decision as far as where you're going to invest that money made you nervous, then clicking that end turn button after your turn of combat without really knowing where the enemy was and if what you did was the best option will outright give you a friggin' heart attack. But that was part of the magical charm and difficulty of XCOM. It was difficult, it was unforgiving, and goddamn was it beautiful. And that's a quick overview of just how deep and fun this game can be. No, seriously, if you haven't played this game, go play it. It's on Steam and it's super, super cheap. The success of XCOM is not overlooked either, consistently making top PC games of all times lists over and over again, and making IGN's #1 PC game of all time both in 2000 and in 2007. It would spawn a sequel named Xcom Terror from the Deep, which would thrust the players into the ocean to deal with an alien threat that had been laying dormant for millions of years. It did what any sequel should do, and didn't fix things that weren't broken while polishing other things that needed a little bit of work, as well as expanding the base building and the unit management. It was received well, and then dark times came to the XCOM series. XCOM Apocalypse, XCOM Interceptor, XCOM Enforcer, XCOM First Alien Invasion, 4 new XCOM games, all of which were ill-received. Whether it had been because of the disastrous collaboration efforts between the development studios for Apocalypse or the excessive campiness of Interceptor, none of these games sold or reviewed well. The following 2 games that were coming after those were cancelled, and the franchise would be shelved for years to come. That's not to say we wouldn't have great turn-based games though. Civilization would dominate the market with Civilization 4 and eventually 5, the real-time 4X would get its due in Sins of the Solar Empire, and the world would be happy. But we wouldn't see or get another XCOM for a long time. That was until eventually Firaxis was able to attain the rights to the franchise. Eventually, rumblings of a new XCOM came and Enemy Unknown by Firaxis would emerge. The king of the turn-based game had come and deemed our old friend XCOM worthy of a new turn-based game. Of course, people were worried. Could they bring such a complex and now niche game to a modern audience, one dominated by consoles and shooters? People were wary, but Firaxis continued and eventually Enemy Unknown launched, and to great success. Trimming down the unnecessary gameplay mechanics of the original, streamlining the combat, updating the graphics brought back this great franchise to a modern audience, and the people rejoiced, living happily ever after. Huh? What's that? Dear God, what is that? Oh no. Oh no, I had forgotten. Please stop it. Make it stop. Help! Dean! Okay, that might have been a little over dramatic, but that about summarized the reaction most XCOM fans had when they saw the trailer to the new take on the series. This was well before anyone even knew what Firaxis was up to with the franchise as well. But let's rewind a little bit. Let's figure out just what happened to the game. The year is 2010. E3 was just around the corner and rumblings of a new game from the BioShock 2 creators was on the horizon. The closer and closer we got to E3, the more and more the rumors began to swirl around the idea of a new XCOM. Sure, they had announced in 2007 they were working on a new XCOM, but outside of one or two pre-alpha shots, we'd heard nothing about it. But people began to get excited, and we hadn't seen a new XCOM game in years. What would it look like? How would it play? Would people be interested outside of the niche strategy PC market? All of these questions needed answering. When that trailer finally reared its head, there was a lot to take in. A game that normally took place in the near future now looked as though we were tossed in the 1950s. The turn-based combat had been changed into the modern first-person shooter. Now, that's not to say there wasn't aspects of our beloved franchise in there somewhere. Much like the original, you had to make decisions on what missions you were going to go on. Each one had certain story aspects as well as a non-linear progression to the end, as well as research bonuses attached to them if you accomplished the mission a particular way. You also put together a personal squad, but the problem was it wasn't as customizable as the XCOM was in the past. Instead of building a team from scratch and naming them after your best friends or hated enemies, you got pre-named people with predetermined stats and soldiers that came along with you on the mission, similar to something along the lines of Mass Effect. In fact, take a look right here at the demo being shown at the E3 2011, the gameplay one right here. They're explaining how the combat system works, and a combat system that remarkably looks like Mass Effect is shown. A menu pops up, you have your options of commands and powers as well as commands to give the two people following you on the mission. You could take cover behind certain things, the difference being that you're not third person, you're in first person. But outside of that, it's remarkably similar to Mass Effect. And instead of tactical turn-based, you have run and gun, baby. You run and gun. So what followed after the announcement of the XCOM remake and its gameplay demo in 2011 was a mixed bag for 2K. The critics and magazines seemed to love what was shown for the most part, and let's be honest, the game does have a very slick and cool look to it, even 2 years after initially seeing it. If it was called anything other than XCOM, I even suspect the game would be out by now. It was unique, it looked and seemed to play well, and 2K has a reputable background when looking at their gaming catalog. So the media had a solid and positive spin on the game. What happened then? Well, it was the fans. They didn't like what they saw, and that's understandable too, as XCOM was a strategy game through and through. Taking what fans loved, the micromanagement, the turn-based tactical squad combat, the base management system, and ditching it is akin to taking Civilization, and instead of running an empire from the Stone Age onward, they just make you make Call of Duty, or Duty Calls Civilization Edition. Anyway, what I'm trying to say was what made XCOM great was gone, and fans disagreed with the direction they had gone. And needless to say, it sent 2K reeling. They defended their remake of the series tooth and nail, but quickly the spotlight on the XCOM remake had kind of dissipated. In fact, after E3 2011, there's little to no trail of the game at all. Very few interviews, gameplay footage is limited to what's already shown, and the game seems to have disappeared into thin air. Almost as though aliens abducted it. Eh? In July of 2011, Christoph Hartmann was interviewed by MCV UK about his involvement on the XCOM remake. Now, Chris is the publishing president of the Civilization games, mind you. When asked why they decided to take a different route with the XCOM, he responded by saying that strategy games are contemporary anymore. Chris, they're not contemporary anymore? You realize you publish Civilization games, right? Have you played them? You realize they sell exceptionally well, right? Right? And not much else was seen about the game otherwise. The release date came and went, delay after delay was announced by 2K until eventually press and news releases about the game stopped entirely. So where did XCOM go? I think it's safe to say the fans got what they wanted in the form of Enemy Unknown, and it shows that if you really yell loud enough, eventually even the bigwigs can hear you. But it very rarely happens that a game that was so far along in development is just thrown away. Lots of money and time was spent, and the business bigwigs want some of that money back. And if you dig deep enough, you can find some answers. In mid-2011, it was discovered that XCOM had been completely revamped, quote-unquote, by 2K, but to what extent was unknown. In early 2012, when asked about the status of XCOM, 2K said it was still in production, had a potential 2014 release. That's about 3 years later than planned. But the most recent news came in October of 2012. One single screenshot with sources that claimed that this was the new XCOM game emerged, showing what seemed to be a third-person tactical shooter. A far cry from the original XCOM, but it's something. To top it off, it's being said that it will be a $30 downloadable game only. that 2K is essentially going to try and cut its losses with the game and make some money back. Basically throwing it up there and saying, please buy our game and download it. It may not be what we showed, but it's something. I promise there's some fun to be had here. It'll be interesting to see if the game does eventually get released as well, and to what form and what shape it's taken over the many years. At the very least, the outcry from what the fans have said definitely made an impact. At worst, making the game go away altogether. At best, potentially minimizing the damage done by revamping it to something completely different. But it also shows that if a developer and a publisher don't see success and people scream loud enough, things can and will change. But without solid evidence that the game is still in progress outside of a, I promise we're still making it, and doesn't seem to be on track for a solid release date yet, in my eyes, XCOM is still missing in action.